Sarah, it's so scary.
Hey, Sarah, unlike you, Amber is sensitive. You should be kind to her.
My husband was kind before we got married. But after we got married and my sister-in-law started coming to visit, he changed. My sister-in-law always makes me the bad guy and hides behind my husband. And my husband gets angry when I don't show love toward my sister-in-law. I was beginning to regret my marriage, as my mother-in-law was the same as my husband. I am Sarah, 32 years old. People around me urged me to get married, and I finally made it happen 6 months ago. I usually work for a company and live with my husband, Mason, who is 3 years older than me. I never really dreamed of getting married. In my department, I am the youngest, and most of the women are in their 40s, and they all spend a lot of time complaining about their husbands during breaks. Some are divorced, and some are single mothers who are having a difficult time. To me, marriage felt like a curse that would tie me down for life. So when Mason and I were dating, I didn't even hint that I wanted to get married. And it was just enough for me to go on a date occasionally. Because once you're married, you're going to see what you don't like about the other person, whether you like it or not. After about 3 months of marriage, feeling a bad vibe, and now that it has been 6 months, the thoughts of divorce was on my mind. The reason I started thinking about it was because Mason's sister, Amber, my sister-in-law. Mason and Amber are 7 years apart, and I think she is 28 now. My in-laws and Mason must have loved or spoiled Amber a lot. She's quite the spoiled brat. Mason had bragged about having a cute little sister many times since we were dating. But I just thought he simply loved his sister at that time. And it never occurred to me that he was attached to his sister. But I think I saw a glimpse of it during our wedding greetings. Even though we were to talk about our marriage, my mother-in-law kept talking about Amber. You know, Amber loves her older brother and a very sweet girl. If you have a fight with Mason, you should call Amber. She'll solve it right away. Mason nodded his head in agreement with his mother, and for some reason he looked very proud. Amber looked a little embarrassed, but when my mother-in-law praised her, she smiled happily. My father-in-law looked ashamed and bewildered, but seemed to just let it happen. I thought to myself that she must have been the youngest and most spoiled child in the family. I thought that when I got married, I would live separately from my in-laws, and that I would inevitably be separated from Amber as well. However, I was wrong. Amber used to come to our house once every 2 weeks when we first got married. But the frequency of her visits has increased to once every 3 days now. She always came when Mason was home on say, "Mason!" and hugs Mason like a child. He would pat her head gently and said,
Oh, Amber, you can't help it, can you? I'm married now, so no more for you.
He says no, but he doesn't mean it. When I look at them with wide eyes, Amber shows tears in her eyes and gives Mason a frightened look. Sarah, it's so scary.
Hey, Sarah. Unlike you, Amber is sensitive. You should be kind to her.
Mason has become a different person since we got married. Where is the kind Mason he used to be? Especially when Amber is involved. He becomes nervous, like a mother cat protecting her child. Even though I thought that my marriage was a failure, I had to live with my husband's relationship with his sister because it was not a valid reason for divorce. Amber's outburst became more serious. I manage Mason's and my salary and give him an allowance of $500 a month. I also have an allowance of $500 for myself to keep it equal. But one day, Amber suddenly said, Mason, I got fired from my job. I don't know how Amber is behaving at work, but it is probably Amber who is at fault. It's obvious from her private life that she hasn't been taking her work seriously, and I feel sorry for the company that hired her.
What? I'm gonna go and complain to them then. Hey, Sarah, we'll have to sue them for unfair dismissal.
But Mason doesn't share my opinion. He wants to bring me into this and drive that poor company even further into the ground. Amber, do you even know why you were fired? Something about how all the guys were nice to me, but all the female seniors were mean to me. And a bunch of them went to their bosses, saying that they will quit because of me. Amber said with tears in her eyes, and Mason became even more furious.
Why would they make such a lovely girl to go through such a thing? I'm gonna go directly to those bosses and have them fired.
Amber looked happy, but I sighed and said, Don't do it. For all I know, Amber must have done something wrong. Why can't you make a reasonable decision when your sister is involved? Then Mason started to get angry at me.
You're just like those seniors. Amber is in pain and suffering,
and you're trying to spread her wounds. You are now like Amber's sister. You should be aware of that. I may have become Amber's sister-in-law, but that doesn't mean I should treat her like a child. If you force me, don't forget that I'll consider divorce. I gave him the cold shoulder the whole time. I'm hoping Mason will get mad and say that he would like a divorce. Then one day, my father-in-law decided to go overseas for 6 months due to his work. My mother-in-law, who gets along well with her husband, decided to leave Amber at their house while they were away. There was an idea behind this, that leaving Amber to live alone for 6 months will encourage her to become more independent. It was my father-in-law who initiated the idea. My mother-in-law, who has the same thoughts as Mason, would never have approved of such a plan. Before my in-laws went overseas, my father-in-law contacted me.
Actually, it's about Amber. I've always felt that my wife and Mason have always loved her and spoiled her a little too much. No matter what I said, I couldn't say anything strong enough when the three of them blamed me, as they felt sorry for Amber. But if we don't do something, Amber will be ruined. If Amber can live on her own while we are abroad and pay for utilities, she'll understand that the world is a tough place.
I nodded in agreement with my father-in-law. Yes, Amber has been spending all of her salary on luxuries, buying only luxury brand items, and I think she has no control of her finances. If she has to live on her own or gets married, I think she will be the one who will have a hard time.
I think you're right. I've told Amber to get a job, even if it was a part-time job, and just pay for the utilities. We'll pay the first payment, since the two of us have been using it together, but after that I want to change the payment name to Amber, and have her pay it herself, and be aware of the fact that she is an adult. But I think Amber will turn to Mason if she's in trouble. I would like him to be tough to her if possible, but I don't think Mason can do that. But if you say something harsh to her, I can see Mason getting angry. If you are in any way uncomfortable, you are welcome to go back to your parents' house.
My father-in-law asked me very politely. I thought this might be a good opportunity to repair my relationship with Mason. And if it doesn't work out, I decided to consider divorce. As soon as my in-laws went overseas, Amber came crying to Mason, just as I thought she would. Mason, I can't afford to pay the utilities. Please help me. Mason was astonished and called out to me.
Hey, Sarah, you should pay for her. You're in charge of the family finances.
What? I can't do that. Why should we pay for the 2 household utilities? Besides, your father is trying to get Amber to learn financial skills by having her pay for her living expenses, right? If we help her, it'll be meaningless.
You know what? Amber is cute and she's going to marry a rich guy. Amber doesn't need financial skills. That has always been too hard on Amber. He's the one who's wrong.
I was too dumbfounded to say anything. My values are too different from theirs. I felt like maybe I could understand people from other cultures better than them. We're from the same country and speak the same language, but if we can't reason with each other, it's not worth talking about anything anymore. With this in mind, I stopped saying anything about Amber from then on. Whether Amber came over to Mason's house every day and was spoiled, or whether she gradually brought her belongings into the house and started living in Mason's room, I decided to ignore them and live by myself. In other words, I started doing only my share of the housework. Then Mason started getting angry.
Why don't you do the chores? You're out of your mind. Cute Amber is having a harder time.
No, I'm the one who is having a hard time. You're so busy with Amber that you don't do your share of housework anymore. Amber doesn't even look for a job. She just lounges around all day and asks for an allowance. How old is Amber? She's not a child. She was a working adult until she got fired, right? It's you who is ruining Amber. You're spoiling her so much that you're turning her into a child who can't do anything. I was so angry that I blurted out the truth, what I had been feeling for a while now. But just as I thought, that logic doesn't work with Mason.
Why not? Amber doesn't have to do anything.
Unlike you, she's pretty and sensitive.
Then maybe you should marry Amber.
Talking to Mason is not constructive. I spoke softly to Amber, the source of the problem. Hey, Amber, do you know it's going to be hard for you? I hope you find a husband who is willing to support you as an old jobless woman. Maybe a rich guy, and somebody like Mason? But the reality is, there's no one like that. And you are the one who will have it hard. I agreed with your father. And I want you to be independent. If you want to stay with us, you're going to have to pay for staying here. If you don't want to do that, then you will have to do all the housework. If you don't want to do that, then go back to your parents' place. You have to be able to earn your own money, at least for utilities. And if you want us to help you, we'll help you at least a little. The only person who can say no to this and no to that are children who are in that kind of phase. Don't you understand that you've been troubling me all along? I said with a smile. But Amber started crying and went to hug Mason again. Mason is constantly berating me and preventing Amber from being independent. After that, I decided to live my life, ignoring these siblings. 2 months after my in-laws went overseas, I received a payment slip for water and utility bills. The mailing name was in Amber's name, but the address was ours. I put them on a table and left them there. I even received a notice that the water supply would stop if the payment is not made. My parents-in-law's house is probably without electricity or gas. After a while, the water supply will be shut off too. It's not mine, so whatever. I decided to ignore everything and leave Amber to my in-laws when they come back. I thought this would make my mother-in-law understand what was the problem. After that, I tried to visit my friend's house as much as possible because Mason and I would fight whenever we saw each other. When I talked to the senior staff at work, they supported me and said that they will be there whenever I'll have to get a divorce. They told me that I should make a record of conversations and that I should keep a diary, which I immediately decided to do. And now it's been 6 months since my in-laws went overseas. The day they returned home was a holiday, and Mason and Amber had gone somewhere, so I was home alone for the first time in a while. Just after noon, the doorbell rang at the apartment. It was my mother-in-law with a furious look on her face. I had a bad feeling about this, as I sent her up to her room.
Amber told me that you promised to pay her utilities until she found a job. I can't believe you ignored that and didn't pay at all. When we came home tired after a long trip, I couldn't believe there was no electricity or water.
Are you harassing us? My mother-in-law is just like Mason. I sighed and explained the situation. Amber was staying with us. She was always been very attached to Mason. And even when we were at work, she was always hanging around the house. She doesn't do any housework. She doesn't pay any nursance fees. So why should we have to pay for your utilities? I thought I said the right thing. But of course my mother-in-law didn't understand.
You know Amber is our princess, right? Why are you being so hard on her? Like her father. She's sensitive and fragile. And we have to protect her.
Is that being a good mother? It means you didn't try to raise your daughter to be a decent adult from the beginning, right? It's Amber who will be in trouble later. If you are a parent, don't you think you should be tough on her now?
What do you know about us?
Just as my mother-in-law and I were arguing, Mason and Amber came home. Now it's 3 against 1. I was able to leave for my parents' house with the bag I had packed earlier when the doorbell rang. I answered the intercom to find my father-in-law standing there. When I let him in, the first thing he did was to scold Amber.
What the hell did you think you were doing? Your mother told me everything. I heard that you had been staying at your brother's and causing trouble for Sarah.
Then it was my mother-in-law who responded.
No, that's not true. Amber couldn't find a job and asked Mason for help. But Sarah gave her a cold shoulder and didn't want to help at all. Mason took pity on Amber and at least let her stay at home. Sarah said she would pay the utilities, but she didn't. The electricity and water were cut off because of Sarah.
I hurried to correct her story.
Oh no, that's completely false. I never said I was going to pay it. Yes, the utility bills did arrive at my house. But I put it on the table in front of the sofa, where Amber always lounges, so that she can easily find it. And I told her to pay it properly. I grabbed my voice recorder and played back the words I had said to Amber a while back. Of course, it included Mason's insane statements. Amber crying to Mason after I had told her this, and Mason berating me. It was my father-in-law who was furious. You guys, I knew you were troubling Sarah. Sarah has been so politely admonishing Amber. And you guys just kept blaming Sarah. I don't understand why you were wrong.
But my mother-in-law, Mason, and Amber don't seem to give a damn about what my father-in-law says to them. My father-in-law must have been annoyed by those 3 for a long time. He would sigh deeply with a sad face. So I made a suggestion. Should I have someone else listen to this audio and have them tell me what they think of it to get a third-party perspective? If they got upset here, it means that they knew it was their fault while they were putting the blame on me. But my mother-in-law's eyes lit up. That's a great idea. Then let's send it to our relatives and let them make a decision. Mason was nodding his head in agreement, and Amber was also happy about the idea. I was so surprised at their attitude that I wondered if my relatives were thinking the same way as my mother-in-law and Mason. But my father-in-law smiled gently to reassure me, and I relaxed a little. To the end, no matter who I asked, all they had to say was that they blamed my mother-in-law. But still, my mother-in-law refused to give up her opinion. So my father-in-law contacted my mother-in-law's mother. My mother-in-law didn't want this and was avoiding my grandmother-in-law, but my father-in-law insisted. She clearly sounded disappointed as we talked to her over the phone. You've always been too protective of Amber. Haven't I told you many times in the past? Nothing good can come from spoiling a child. I know I was too hard on you. And because of that, you thought you would raise her nicely, but what good is that?
If she doesn't turn out to be a decent adult, I'll re-educate her from the ground up. So you can send Amber over to me.
My grandmother-in-law finally gave her a stern talking to, and my mother-in-law couldn't seem to resist, so they were to leave Amber at her house for a while. Mason was still not convinced, and I had long since given up on him. I want a divorce after all. What you've done and said may not be grounds for divorce, but they were grounds enough for divorce for me. I don't want you in my life again, I told Mason. Mason started yelling and complaining to me. So I told him that it would be better for both of us if we got a divorce. So we went to the city office together and filed the divorce papers. My parents were very opposed to me getting a divorce. They ambushed me in front of my office and tried to persuade me to reconsider. I told my company about the situation, and they transferred me to a new position. And I started living alone far away from my parents' house. My parents occasionally contacted me, recommending to get back together with Mason. But they were not worried about me. They just don't want people to look at them with a jaundiced eye because they have a divorced single daughter over 30 years old. If they really cared about me, wouldn't they be sympathetic to me after having my life ruined by a sister-spoiling man? Thus, I try to not contact my parents as much as possible and protect my private life. Marriage is not just about you and the person you love. It also involves other in-laws. If so, I want to live freely. If I find someone I want to spend the rest of my life with, I would probably get married again, even if it means I would have to bear the burden of my in-laws. I am now concentrating on my work and leading a more fulfilling life than I did before my divorce.